Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Israel's educated workers are leaving the nation in droves. That's while its war on Gaza has ground its vital economic sectors to a halt. Can it afford another war with Lebanon? Lebanon is in a deep economic crisis and its infrastructure is already battered. A full-out war with Israel could strain its limited resources even further. And the British Prime Minister has vowed to rebuild his nation's economy, but Keir Starmer has warned that unpopular decisions will be needed to do that. Almost a year into the war on Gaza, Israel's economy is facing its deepest decline in years. Military spending is ballooning, borrowing is rocketing, and revenues are drying up. International trust in an economy once seen as an entrepreneurial engine is waning. Thousands of highly educated and skilled workers are leaving Israel, while attracting new talent to a country at war is challenging, to say the least. Israeli economists fear that a wider war in the Middle East could strain the economy even further. They say that only a ceasefire can help to repair the extensive financial damage. Fintan Monaghan reports.
Israel's war on Gaza has dragged on for nearly a year. More than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed and the Strip's infrastructure lies in ruins. In contrast, Israel appears comparatively unscathed. But under the surface, the war is putting pressure on the economy. GDP has fallen, the costs of the war are ramping up the deficit, and its credit rating has been cut. A growing number of economists believe the war is becoming unsustainable.
A regular year, we are growing at a rate of 3.7%, which means that if you want it in dollar terms, we are going to lose this year in GDP $14 billion. But it's only in GDP, we're losing much more. But if we be stubborn and continue the war until I don't know what, then I think we will not recover.
The war has removed vital workers from the economy. Nearly 300,000 Israeli citizens have been called up to fight, the largest mobilization of reservists in the country's history. These include professionals in key sectors like technology that are not easily replaced. In addition, many high-value workers are leaving the country and not coming back. Official figures show more than 12,000 Israelis left in October and have chosen not to return. That's nearly 3 times the usual figure. In the months since, departures have returned to normal levels, but the number of returnees is still 21% less than normal. Other parts of the economy are also losing workers. Construction and agriculture relied heavily on around 80,000 Palestinians, mostly from the occupied West Bank. Since the war, they've been denied entry. Some effects of the war on Gaza will be temporary, but others could have a more lasting impact. And the longer the conflict drags on, the harder it might be to reverse the damage. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, of all 38 member countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Israel's economy has faced the biggest slowdown between April and June. GDP was expected to grow 3% in 2024, but the Bank of Israel now predicts a growth rate of 1.2%. One of the biggest drivers of the slowdown is exports, which declined by 8.3%. The construction and agriculture sectors have been hit by a shortage of Palestinian workers who are no longer allowed into Israel from the occupied West Bank and Gaza. Inflation accelerated more than expected last month to 3.6% year-on-year. Travel and vegetable prices were among the items that rose the most in August. More than 46,000 businesses have closed since the start of the war. The budget deficit rose to more than 8% of GDP over the last 12 months. And credit rating agencies have downgraded Israel for the first time in its history. Now, economists say the total cost of the war could amount to $120 billion, or 20% of GDP. Joining us now from Lancaster in the UK is Eyal Winter, who's a professor of economics at the Hebrew University and professor of economy at Lancaster University. Good to have you with us, Professor. Despite what we were saying there, when you do a deep dive on the data, Israel's economy appears to be pretty stable at the moment. Inflation, while rising, is under control. Personal debt is relatively low. But Under how much strain is the economy really, and can it sustain that strain? Can it take it for much longer?
Well, the economy is on strain. War is not something simple to go through economically, and Israel is facing the cost of the war very prominently. Recently, there were decisions, or they are planning to raise taxes and remove tax relief that have been embedded in the budget for many years to cover this extra cost. And of course, the extended war with Hezbollah increased the cost. There's now a major draft taking place in Israel that will also reduce the labor market, the active labor market. And all of these are, of course, as you described, are due to the war.
All right, given that, can Israel afford another war with Lebanon?
Well, it's not a matter of affording. Israel can afford, first of all, right? From a pure economic point of view, Israel has the reserve to it. And, you know, when it comes to military conflict, the issue is not whether you can afford it. The issue is whether you have the support for it. And you may be surprised by the Israeli support to the war against Hezbollah. It's not against Lebanon. It's a war against Hezbollah has more support than the operation Israel did after October 7 in Gaza. Israelis are very angry. They have a very strong rage against the Hezbollah. First of all, due to the many hundreds of thousands displaced Israelis that had left to leave their homes in the north of Israel. They don't understand. Israelis don't understand what Hezbollah has to do with it. Well, the way they perceive it is that the way that almost everybody in the Western world perceive it is that they are driven by Iran,
Yep.
and they are not party to the conflict.
Professor, you mentioned people moving away from the north of Israel
Yes.
due to the ongoing conflict on that border region that's been going on since October the 7th. I mean, that must affect Israel economically as well. But also at the beginning of the program, we mentioned about the brain drain, the fact that so many young, well-educated professionals are choosing to leave Israel right now because of what is going on. How does that impact the economy in the long term?
That impact the economy, that may impact the economy substantially. But I have to remind you one thing is that much of the professional labor power, human capital in Israel is in the tech industry, right? In the high-tech industry. These are people that basically can do the work anywhere in the world, okay? So many of them who leave the country, okay, are taking the job with them. They don't resign. They don't take a leave of absence. They just go on either Cyprus or the UK or anywhere else and continue their job online. This is possible if you're dealing with AI or you're working in a development of a software or if you're developing a product. This is, these days, is possible. People have done it through COVID 2 years ago, and they're doing it again.
You mentioned,
Yes.
Professor, the resilience of the Israeli economy. It has bounced back after previous conflicts. But as you say, this war is dragging out. It's gone on for 11 months right now.
This war is dragging out.
Yeah,
It's long.
so
It's much longer than people expected.
Again, so how long would it take, if this all ended tomorrow, how long would it take the Israeli economy to recover?
Very quickly. If it ends tomorrow, it will allow the Israeli economy to recover very quickly because psychologically people will realize that if the war is over and there is a deal that guarantees certain security for the country in the next several years, then it will be like COVID. When COVID ended, people realized there is no reason why the recession will adhere while problems will continue. We're going back to work, and things are going to be better. The same effect will prevail if the war ends quickly.
Good to talk to you, Professor. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, the war has inflicted a far heavier toll on Gaza and the Palestinian economy, of course. The humanitarian and health crisis in Gaza is worsening by the hour, while aid into the Strip is still very limited. Meanwhile, major Israeli banks have stopped accepting shekel cash transfers from Palestinian banks in the occupied West Bank. The move could soon prevent Palestinians from accessing vital goods and services. The territory's economic activity has almost ground to a halt due to attacks by Israeli soldiers and settlers. Now to Lebanon, where Israel has carried out its most violent assault on the nation in decades. An all-out war with Israel could cost Lebanon hundreds of millions of dollars a day. The risks for the nation this time are far bigger than during the war with Israel in 2006. The cash-strapped country is reeling after years of political and economic crises. Government corruption and mismanagement has left it without a stable electricity supply or a proper banking system. Many Lebanese people are receiving aid to survive. The latest wave of violence and internal displacement could strain the nation's resources even further. Keir reports.
Israeli airstrikes have pounded Lebanon, killing hundreds, displacing thousands and causing massive damage. There'd been exchanges of fire with Hezbollah since the war on Gaza began in October, but Israel's latest offensive is a major escalation. As the danger of an all-out war grows, so too fears of an economic collapse.
We are seeing
the destruction of large areas of agricultural land and residential buildings in the majority of the regions of Lebanon. This has damaged the economy of our country and threatened our social order, especially after many countries have requested their citizens to leave Lebanon.
Lebanon has already been in an economic crisis since 2019. Electricity and public services are barely functioning. The currency has lost 90% of its value. Families have lost their savings, and 80% of the population is living below the poverty line. In September, the former head of the central bank, Riyad Salami, was arrested on corruption charges. But critics say the problem goes far beyond one man. They blame Lebanon's elites for mismanaging the economy and failing to implement reforms.
Everyone who's collaborated with Riyad Salami, whether they were in the deep state or in the banks, be they thieves, money launderers or in the media, they should be in jail with him.
Thousands have fled the bombing, and Israel has warned Lebanese people to move away from any area where Hezbollah is active. According to the UN, even a limited escalation could see 250,000 people displaced. Lebanon would struggle to deal with this and will likely have to rely on international funding. An all-out war could drive 1 million people from their homes and put the country itself at risk of collapse. Keir, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Joining us from Beirut is Sami Halabi, Policy Director at the Beirut-based Alternative Policy Institute. Good to have you with us. Sami, you heard Professor Eyal Winter a few moments ago talking about the cross-border fighting on Lebanon's border with Israel, which Hezbollah, of course, says it's carrying out in support of the people of Gaza. That's been happening since October 7th last year. How much of an impact has that had on Lebanon's economy?
Well, I mean, Lebanon's economy was in dire straits before this conflict, and I think we are really playing with a very, very sensitive situation at the moment. I mean, as your lead-up rightly proclaimed, the years of financial mismanagement that was brought about by the political class, but also the banking class, who are usually one and the same, means that there has been no investment. Key sectors such as tourism have collapsed. Because of the war that's ongoing, and the prices are going up, and small businesses are feeling the pinch. I mean, there's a human capital flight that's incredible. So what we're seeing right now is the expansion of an informal economy, one that resembles a war economy, extortionist behavior thriving as state resources shrink. And so this conflict really needs to be put in context from an economic perspective when we understand the full repercussions of what could possibly happen. The major fear right now is a major infrastructure strike on our ports, our airports, our seaports, which would lead to full economic collapse and increased corruption and reliance on more illicit and illegal activities.
There have been calls for a ceasefire, of course, but what would an all-out war with Israel mean for Lebanon's economy?
Well, I mean, let's try to understand things from a humanitarian perspective as well. I mean, 65% of the Lebanese and 90% of the Syrians were already in need of humanitarian aid before this war. A prolonged conflict for the Lebanese economy would be an absolute disaster. There are already very little resources to fund the current displacement crisis that we're dealing with. Let's take Lebanon's healthcare system, for instance. I mean, when the last war happened between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, there were about 13,000 hospital beds. Now we're down to 8,000. Lots of medical professionals have already left the country because of the financial crisis. So we don't have the capacity to deal with a prolonged war. A prolonged war will push Lebanon further into poverty, exacerbate food insecurity, deepen inequality. And the real fear, I think, among many is that civil strife could emerge as state structures continue to deteriorate and tensions build between communities. I mean, this is including the Syrian refugee community, which is often scapegoated for the failings of the Lebanese government. I think this is what Israel is betting on. Obviously, Netanyahu is playing for time. He doesn't have a very good situation on his hands. I mean, military spending in Israel is up 100%. That's before this war. If you can imagine how much it will increase, I don't think the Israelis really understand the cost that they will have to bear. And I think that this is part of Netanyahu's calculations as well. He's thinking, you know, if I can sow internal strife in Lebanon, then Hezbollah will kneel to internal pressures and make concessions at the negotiating table. And I think this is the game, the sick game that's being played right now. But I also think the Lebanese understand this, and that will help to supersede internal strife while hopefully a negotiated settlement comes to pass. But I fear that the economic recovery of Lebanon will be much harder when the dust settles, because you have a lot more ground to gain to get back to zero and then to actually recover.
All right, so the government, we're agreed, does not really have the funds or the resources to deal with a humanitarian crisis. What about a plan, at least, to secure the essential needs of its people? Does it have one?
Well, I have to say, for the first time in a long time, the Lebanese authorities seem somewhat prepared. They've had a year to prepare. There are shelters in place for around 1 million Lebanese at the moment, Lebanese and Syrian refugees, and also Palestinian refugees that have been in the country since the creation of Israel in 1948. But they need about $100 million a month to sustain this. They don't have that money. Food and medicine are stockpiled for about 5 to 6 months. But the problem is that diesel reserves are available for about 4 to 6 weeks. And if you put that together, what you're looking at is a country that is ill prepared to deal with increased demand in a prolonged conflict. And despite the stockpiling efforts, I think it won't be enough. There simply isn't enough money. There simply isn't enough resources, and there simply isn't enough manpower to deal with a prolonged humanitarian crisis in the country.
Good to talk to you, Sami. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
The use of pagers and walkie-talkies in coordinated explosions in Lebanon has drawn scrutiny to the security of global supply chains. While it's unclear how the devices exploded, Lebanese officials accuse Israel of tampering with them. Analysts say that people's trust in their electronic devices has taken a hit after the incidents. They expect governments to restrict the flow of sensitive technology and encourage companies to move manufacturing closer to home. Left-leaning Anura Kumara Dissanayake has been sworn in as Sri Lanka's 10th president. His election was the first to be held since mass protests unseated Gotabaya Rajapaksa in 2022, after Sri Lanka suffered its worst economic crisis. Dissanayake has promised to crack down on corruption and to continue the bailout deal struck with the International Monetary Fund. He's also pledged to reduce the impact of its austerity measures on the country's poorest. Difficult times are ahead for the British economy. That's the warning from the British Prime Minister. But Keir Starmer has assured the British people that he won't go down the road of austerity, despite planned budget cuts and tax rises. He insisted that tough decisions will in the end lead to what he called a national renewal during the Labour annual party conference. The gathering was aimed at striking a more positive note after his government was accused of doom-mongering over the state of the economy. The PM has been under pressure over the decision to limit winter fuel payments to the elderly and his use of donations for clothing and hospitality. Let's hear what he had to say.
People say we can't deliver national renewal, but we can and we will. We will stabilise our economy, clear out the Tory rot, fix the foundation and deliver the mandate of change, a Britain built to last, built with respect, built with pride, because together we have shown that Britain belongs to you.
But are people buying into Starmer's promises? Let's hear what some British people think.
I don't think they've proved themselves yet, because they've only been in office for a very short time. And obviously talk is cheap. Everyone can say that they're going to do a lot of things, and whether they do those things is a whole nother ball game. So we're now going to have to wait for at least 2 years to see how it helps the economy and see how it helps the British people. You know, it's a waiting game, and basically they're all the same.
They left quite a mess. The previous party, not the Labour Party, behind. And the country is financially strained. So it's going to take tough decisions, just like they said, raising taxes. That would be an obvious one. Raising taxes on people that can afford it, not on people that can, in order to return the services that are badly needed.
I feel the cronyism and the nepotism going on. Where I live in Wanstead, there's a guy called John Cryer, used to be my local MP, and he's just stood down right at the last minute. His wife is Ellie Reeves, sister of Rachel Reeves. So when he goes to the House of Lords in December, or gets New Year's honours, he'll be getting £300 a day to sign in. That's how I feel about Labour. Absolutely disgusting. And what he's done to the old age pensioners is absolutely immoral. 4,000 people a year are going to freeze, and if he's going to be here for 5 years, that's 20,000.
Joining us now from London is Nina Skero, Chief Executive at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Good to have you with us, Nina. The new government claims that there's a giant fiscal hole in the UK that needs plugging. Is there, and who's responsible for that? The Labour government is blaming the previous Conservative administration.
Well, is there a fiscal hole? Yes, there is. How large it is very subjective, because the way something like that is calculated is very, very sensitive to forecasts. And in the UK's case, the forecasts from the OBR, which is sort of an independent body looking at the UK economy and sort of a watchdog, really, operating alongside the government. But I think probably one of the biggest, for me, takeaways from the Labour Party conferences is that sort of the definition at how you look at the fiscal hole, the fiscal gap, might change, because it is actually something that is a self-imposed rule and a self-imposed definition. So the government has the scope not only to raise taxes, to reallocate or cut spending to address the fiscal situation, but they actually more fundamentally also have the ability to say, we don't have to stick to these rules. Here is an alternative set of rules, and that is what the new target will be. So that's why it's very difficult to see how large the fiscal hole is. It's very subject to forecasts, and also the definition actually might change at the budget.
The Prime Minister has warned of an uncomfortable budget to come in a month's time. Is he going about things the right way? Do you think he's warning the public that things will need to get tough? Are the plans that have been rumoured the right ones, you think, to fix this fiscal hole?
There is definitely a lot of very careful messaging going on. We just heard in the program, and I fully agree with this, that the Labour conference actually saw a pretty marked shift in tone. Before the conference, there was quite a lot of stark negativity, some of it warranted, but some of it slightly overblown. For example, a couple of weeks ago, we had the comment from the Chancellor that we are possibly facing a loss of confidence in the pound. I think remarks like that haven't been especially helpful because they're not particularly rooted in reality. I do think, on the other hand, it is fair to say that the country is not in a particularly strong position economically. But what I have liked seeing at the conference is that the shift seems to be moving on, not just from how do we in the immediate future raise taxes, how do we improve the fiscal positioning, but actually how do we stimulate growth? Because that is what the big question should be. If you have higher economic growth, you will have higher tax intakings, even at current rates of taxation. And that is why the big question should be not just how do we change the taxation and spending, but how do we stimulate growth?
Okay.
And that is what I will be hoping to see in the budget as well.
So how does the Prime Minister stimulate growth? I mean, do you foresee perhaps closer ties with Europe sometime during this Parliament? That would help, surely, wouldn't it, after Brexit?
That will help. I think the timelines on how it will help are quite questionable, as we've seen in the aftermath of Brexit. Changing long-established trade practices can take quite a while. So it's not sort of just a pendulum that can now swing back. Things that have changed in the aftermath of Brexit, I don't think can very quickly be reversed. I think probably more an area that the new government is looking at and where they've really pinned a lot of their hopes in terms of stimulating growth is planning reform, building housing, key infrastructure. I think that is also what is going to be probably used as a justification to tinker with the fiscal rules, that it's okay to have a more, let's say, relaxed set of targets if it's going to building houses, building infrastructure. So I think sort of trying to instigate more of a construction, more of a building boom via the planning reforms is probably the big ticket policy that the government is taking its hopes on.
Nina, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to get in touch with us and comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at @afinnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC, or you could drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page. There you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.